the sort of Keynesian paradigm of economics in which the state, not the entrepreneur and the market, was the driving force of economic life. That view of development took hold, and very much took hold in the World Bank, then later in Unctad and so on. And it was a view really which rejected Adam Smith's inquiry into the causes of the growth of the wealth of nations, and it replaced it with a view in which the key actor in creating prosperity was the state. There was alleged to be a lack of investment, a lack of capital and therefore investment in developing countries. And as a result, foreign aid was put forward as the only answer. It seems to me that since then, the success of enterprise, whether it's been the Asian tigers or whether it was Hong Kong and China or East and West Germany, more recently the advent of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India and China, which has really been a phenomenal development. Even now, the outlook for growth, for example, in a country like India is 7%, despite the doldrums in the world economy. After India gave up the licensed Raj, which it inherited from British Fabianism. And if you ask the question, why did the World Bank move from aid to enterprise? It was basically because it failed. It recognized that that world in which the state was the key driver of economic prosperity simply didn't work. However, while we have won the economic argument, it seems to me we are far away from having won, in some sense, the moral argument. People in this room this morning may feel, like I do, that we have a strong moral base, which is what I want to set out in a minute. But on the other hand, I think that a lot of people see enterprise as really an excuse for a Darwinian social jungle. And they see it as capitalism, exploitation, inequality, injustice. And nowhere is this view held more than, I'm afraid, in the Christian church and among church leaders, who really have a sort of view which I would call a sort of soft Marxism. They would never clothe it in Marx's language, but fundamentally it's a view of the world where the creation of wealth is a zero-sum game. If I gain, you lose. Where, in addition to that, the inequality and so on, which derives from that, is the result of a class struggle, capitalists versus the workers. And what we see, which is not, I think, terribly well articulated, but what we see in Occupy Wall Street and throughout various cities in the world and throughout various cathedrals in the world, it is an attempt to articulate this point of view. However inadequately intellectually it's articulated, and regrettably, in the context of the financial crisis, this, I think, has struck a major chord with many of our fellow citizens. And if you think of the budget of 2 days ago and the austerity which people in this country now have to face for up to 6 years, this, I think, is a tremendous challenge to those of us who believe that there is a foundation, a moral foundation for enterprise. So if you say, what is the moral foundation for enterprise? Because my time is not unlimited this morning. I want to state it in terms of 5 points. That a Judeo-Christian view of the world starts with a conception of the human person which is radically different from that of socialism or romanticism or the rationalism of the environment. And if I can quote to you Wilhelm Röpke, German economist and social philosopher, in his book, The Humane Economy. And if you haven't read Sam Gregg's book on Rupke, I can assure you it's well worth reading, and I would recommend it. This is what Rupke says. My picture of man is fashioned by the spiritual heritage of classical and Christian tradition. I see in man the likeness of God. I am profoundly convinced that it is an appalling sin to reduce man to a means, even in the name of high-sounding phrases, and that each man's soul is something unique, irreplaceable, priceless, in comparison with which all other things are as naught. I am attached to a humanism which is rooted in these convictions and which regards man as the child and image of God, but not as God himself, to be idolized as he is by the hubris of a false and atheist humanism. These, he says, are the reasons why I so greatly distrust all forms of collectivism. And I must say, I don't think I could express my own views more clearly than the way they're expressed there. That the human person is at the center of economic life. The right to life, the right to liberty, the right to profit, and the greatest recognition that mankind is created in the image of God is freedom, because only a free decision can be judged by moral criteria. In the economic sphere, it's the freedom to buy and sell, to exchange, to take risk, to invest, to save, to seek employment, to migrate, to succeed, to fail, and to bear the consequences. And it's this freedom which is provided in a market economy. It's the freedom for the individual, I suppose epitomized by the entrepreneur, to express creativity, but not confined to the entrepreneur, to take economic initiatives, to move geographically to find work, to take risk, to innovate, to invent new things. And in Jewish theology, and especially in terms of the early chapters of Genesis, I think scholars have come to a sort of consensus as to what the image of God means, which is that much as rulers, kings and pharaohs and so on, had coins and things like that, which express their image, so we are the image of God. And it's not just that the elite are the image of God, the leading people in a society are the image of God, but it's that every individual. It's such a radical idea that the poorest of the poor is also bearing that image of God. And we have in Genesis that command that we are to take responsibility for the world in terms of using its resources for the common good, but also specifically to take care of it. So the human being is seen as God's vice-regent in this world. Secondly, that sense of, or that understanding of economic freedom leads to the private ownership of property within the rule of law. This is really, I think, absolutely fundamental. Because if you have freedom and you enter into a contract, you must have confidence that the contract will be honoured and that there is a legal process which will redress any wrongs. So private ownership is an essential condition for enterprise. Hard work, risk-taking by individuals can be rewarded. They have something that they can call their own, that we can call our own. Hernandez de Soto says that in the developing world, I love this expression of his, he says the developing world is teeming with millions of entrepreneurs, who are frustrated because of the lack of secure property rights. An insight which is fundamental. And if you want to be more theological, I've always been amazed, I suppose, at two things. One, as I read Father papal encyclicals over the years, I've been impressed that ever since Rerum Novarum, which after all was pretty tough on business, but there has always been in Catholic social thought a strong belief in the private ownership of property and the need of the rule of law to protect it. Perhaps in a way more surprisingly, that was also true in the Old Testament and in the political economy of Israel. Because when the Jews settled the Promised Land, it was very interesting that each family had an allocation of property. And if you felt there was any time when you could have had a sort of major kibbutz experiment, this would have been it. But not at all. Each family was given property which was their own, and then the land laws of the economy of Israel are fascinating because there was the laws were an attempt to ensure that each family had a permanent interest in the land, and hence you have the sabbatical laws, the laws of Jubilee and so on, when people experience misfortune. But I think that that is something which is very important. The third point, I would say, in terms of the exercise of freedom, is that when you have a conception of the individual created in the image of God and therefore deserving of economic and political freedom and the ownership of property, the exercise of that freedom leads you naturally into markets. And the market economy is an economic system which is developed around the principle of voluntary exchange at freely determined prices. So people will buy or sell something if it's to their advantage, so that both parties benefit from the transaction. And as I said earlier, a market is not a place in which one person gains because another person fails. The genius of a market, which is voluntary, is that both parties benefit from that transaction. And the great insight of Adam Smith, I think restated beautifully by Friedrich Hayek, is that in an economy where people are free to pursue their own interests, then prices will adjust in order to coordinate the diverse interests of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, and in the process create prosperity for everyone. And two things I think, if you look at the Hayekian defense of the free market, are important. The first is price flexibility. You know, it's very interesting. When you have the state in the driving seat of an economy, you almost invariably have attempts to control prices. Maybe a prices and incomes policy, maybe exchange controls, maybe fixed exchange rates, maybe some arbitrary intervention for commodity prices and so on. But almost invariably the state will step in and prevent the free movement of prices. Prices moving are valuable for two reasons. Firstly, they provide enormous information to producers, to consumers, to investors, to savers about changing market conditions. And as a result of the information they provide, so people can respond accordingly. But secondly, not only do they provide the information, but they provide the incentive. The price goes up and you respond to it and say, whatever you're doing, say a simple farmer, you're clearly going to get a higher return by doing it. So it's not just the information, but it is the added incentive to do so. And secondly, I think in the defense of markets, competition is extremely important. The fourth aspect, I would say, of the moral basis of a market economy is that freedom is absolutely critical. Private property is critical. Markets are critical. But as Irving Kristol pointed out many years ago, and people like Daniel Bell and others, and indeed Rupke points out in The Humane Economy, that a free society by itself is not enough. That we also need the move towards what you might call a just society. And so often the just society is captured by socialism. But those of us who believe in enterprise and the value of enterprise shouldn't be afraid to actually say that we do need safety nets within capitalism, within the market economy. Keith Joseph, who was a terrific inspiration to Mrs. Thatcher and to many of us here, talked about the social market economy. And I strongly believe that in the case we make for the market, for the moral basis of enterprise as opposed to aid, we should never forget this social dimension to it. I think it was expressed, Father Sirico, by yourself in your introduction when you talked about our non-negotiable commitments to the poor. And finally, following on from that, I don't think you can have a market economy without certain values. In other words, it requires certain institutions, private property, markets, competition, freedom of prices and so on. But it also requires people to hold certain values. And one, for example, is personal responsibility, accountability. They lie deep in our Judeo-Christian heritage. Human beings created in the likeness of God, but not God, possessed of free will and conscience, endowed with the ability to distinguish right from wrong, having the power and opportunity to make deliberate choices, but invariably personally responsible and accountable for their actions. A second value, I think, is trust, which is really the glue to any community. Trust grows from the expectation, based on experience and the assessment of character, that others within that community will act with integrity, honesty, and goodwill based on a common shared set of values. The community could be a society, the community could be the City of London, the community could be any sub-community you care to think of. But trust builds up social capital. And the market economy is frequently attacked for being individualistic, whereas actually nothing could be further from the truth. I always go back to Professor Edward Banfield of Harvard, that study that he did in the 50s on the causes of poverty in rural southern Italy, where he concluded that the backwardness, he said, was not due to ignorance or class oppression or pathological distrust of the state, but to what he called the ethos of the amoral family. And that seems to me to be very important. And a third value is that of commutative justice. There has to be rules to the game of enterprise. There are rules to the game of the market economy. As a result, the rules must be known. They hold for everyone. The rules must be clear. The rules must be fair. And as a result, the result of the game, therefore, will not be judged in relation to moral worth. So I think that this whole issue of the values of a market economy and the need for an enterprise economy to have a foundation to values is probably the most challenging issue that we face in the West today, and also in the developing world, because the culture in which our market economy is embedded is, I think, increasingly becoming an amoral culture, frequently under the guise of some sort of libertarian philosophy. And as a result, it's not anchored to what, in a non-pejorative sense, you would call bourgeois values. Honesty, a sense of public spiritedness, decency, community, and so on. Some years ago, Daniel Bell wrote an article on the cultural contradictions of capitalism, where he raised the question, are we moving from the Protestant ethic to the psychedelic bazaar?